So possibly the most famous, if not the most famous, of the Federalist Papers is Federalist 10 by James Madison. And Federalist 10 is a well-written piece of literature by James Madison, who was inarguably a genius. However, there are limits to the value of the Federalist Papers because, number one, they were trying to recommend the Constitution, and number two, they were written before the Constitution was implemented, and for that reason, their theory on how the Constitution was supposed to work was speculative, not necessarily historical. So Federalist 10 deals with the problem of factions. And in Federalist 10, James Madison abandons centuries of political theory in that he rejects the idea that a republic ought to be small. Now, he's dealing with this issue of factions, which are interest groups, which he will define and explain that one of the issues of small republics, in his estimation, is that within small republics, it is easier for interest groups to form and influence the government against the rights of other citizens. And his analysis of the problem is true. And it is a serious problem. That the fact of the matter is interest groups can form and think that they have some sort of righteous cause, as everybody does, in order to influence the state to make laws against their fellow citizens, to make policies, to enforce things against their fellow citizens that are against their interests, against the rights of others. This is why democracies are vulnerable. This is why republics are vulnerable to this, because if you have popular government, whether direct democracy or representative democracy in more of a republic, and even rule of law, human beings still make the law and they're vulnerable to outside influences. They themselves having a tendency to err and to abuse of power. So Madison wrote, by a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens, or to the permanent aggregate interests of the community. So what Madison defines as a faction, it could be a majority of the people in a small republic, could be a minority that's just politically actuated and has access to be influential to the government. Maybe they have money, maybe they have time, maybe they have political organization, but they are united behind some sort of common goal in order to forward their interests and want to do so via the government. And that can be very dangerous against others. People use the government as a tool of force against those with whom they disagree in a way that they would never imagine doing as an individual, because if they behaved in such a way as an individual, they would be guilty of a crime. So Madison recognizes this problem, and he says that this problem is more prevalent in small republics because in small republics, more can be done with less numbers of people. For example, in a republic that has, say, 100,000 people in it, 1,000 people or a couple thousand people can be hugely influential, even if they are not the majority. And knowing human nature, they could use their influence against others. And since the government has a monopoly on that use of force, they will use the government to achieve their goals. And this can happen in a republic, this can happen in a democracy, this can happen in any government. And so he's concerned that interest groups that might use government against the rights of others. And in a smaller area, it's easier for someone to gather an interest group in order to do that. But interest groups are built into human nature. They are built into the way that people act. If we thought about it ourselves, we could probably identify the fact that we are part of multiple interest groups. They can be things that are political or non-political, could be religion, could be a group you identify with based on what language or languages you speak, could be ethnic or national, could be racial, could be on race or gender or some sort of common goal or interest you share with other people. Any common interest that unites you with others is an interest group. Now, it may not be a political interest group that seeks to influence the government, but it is an interest group nonetheless. And what Madison is concerned with is this natural tendency in humans to form groups may be dangerous to the rights and liberties of others, especially if they use the government to make their desires and actions legal. And so Madison's concern is a very real one. And his argument to solve it is what Federalist 10 focuses on. So he fears factions, these interest groups within small republics, and his solution was to have a large republic over the states. This is his solution for the United States, if they accept the Constitution, that there will be a large republic, a republic of republics in the United States. Therefore, local factions will have less power. For example, this is not meant with any offense, but there are a lot of Mormons in Utah. State and local governments may be influenced by that concentration of that interest group. But when extended to the whole United States, that local and state interest group has less power. So Mormons do not have as much influence or opportunity for influence over the US government as they might have in the state of Utah or localities within Utah. And it's not a good or bad thing. That's just what Madison is identifying. The potential for interest groups to gather and influence is more prevalent in smaller republics. Therefore, he argues for a larger republic that will dilute the power and influence of these local factions, interest groups. Now, he points out there are kind of two methods of dealing with the factions. And these are actually in reverse order in his paper, but I'll handle them this way. He says there are two ways of dealing with factions. You can either prevent the causes of factions, interest groups, what makes them happen. You can try to cut that off so that factions will be impossible. Or you can try to control its effects. Now, he says the issue with preventing its causes, there are two ways that you could do that. One is that you could try to ensure that everybody has the same opinions. If everybody has the same opinions, thinks the same way, shares the same values, then there's no opportunity for factions and divisions and separate interest groups and competing schools of thought to arise if everybody thinks the same way. But as Madison says, the latent causes of a faction are within human nature. So it is not really feasible to do that. It's impossible. The other one is you could destroy liberty. You could destroy freedom, people's freedom to speak, think differently, associate. All these freedoms could be destroyed, and you would have to destroy liberty totally and not allow people to gather with those with whom they agree, and not allow people to speak, and not allow people to think, and not allow people to protest, and not allow people to have any type of difference of opinion. But this would obviously be a tyranny. So he says that that solution would be like saying we should get rid of air so that we don't have fires anymore. Fires, as he recognizes, and as we all know, can be very dangerous, but it would be worse to get rid of air because that would kill everyone. So he says liberty is to faction what air is to fire. And just as we don't say that we should get rid of air so that we never have fires again, that's the same as saying we should get rid of liberty so that we never have factions again. And so he says the solution is to instead control the effects of a faction. And his solution is then to extend to a large republic. He writes, extend the sphere, meaning enlarge the republic, and you take in a greater varieties of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. So he proposes a kind of interesting solution to this problem of factions. Have a larger republic, people won't know about each other as much, and they won't, even if they do have some, the majority of people do have some sort of terrible idea to harm the rights of their fellow citizens via the government, they won't have access to each other. You know, somebody sitting in Wisconsin won't know about somebody sitting in California, even if they both have the same common interests. However, we can forgive Madison here, but the internet and other things made this possible, and certain things even in Madison's own day, where he did not predict national interest groups. He only dealt with local interest groups. And so he said that this would be less likely to cause factions. Now, with Madison's reasoning, here's how it kind of works out. These are 4 different small republics, image that I've created to kind of show what his reasoning is. And the colors represent just different interests. They could be anything. And so they all are 4 different countries. They all have their own governments and laws. Now you see here, blue can be very influential with the government here because they have a majority interest group. So should they choose to, they could be influential over people who are in a minority interest group or other citizens who are not politically actuated. And so Madison is right, that's very dangerous, but his solution is if we have a large republic, now blue's influence is diluted. Doesn't mean it's non-existent. It just means that it has been considerably diminished. However, Madison still has a problem. And this took several years of study of Madison's work to finally even recognize this problem, part of which he should have recognized, but part of which we can forgive him for not anticipating this. But what I've identified as I think, logical inconsistency here is that if it's a problem, if interest groups are a problem on the small level of small republics, won't they be a problem with a large republic? All the same factors are there, except it's bigger. Human nature is still the same. interest groups still exist, and it is still a republic that is influenced by the voice of the people, and the voice of the people can often be concentrated in interest groups. And so Madison should have recognized that this could be the same problem, just on a bigger scale. Now, where we can be generous in our assessment of Madison is the fact that, one, his views are speculative. He didn't see, when he wrote this, how things would actually work out in the United States. And two, he didn't understand that the technology would develop to the point where there can be national interest groups that influence the government. Nothing in effect has been solved. He's dealt with the local faction. Yes, blue is not as powerful, but one of these other interest groups might be. And with that being the case, you run into a republic that is so large that it can either be oligarchic and not represent the people, or it only represents interest groups that have enough time, money, and resources to communicate with the government over the average citizen. And some would think that the solution ought to be, well, we need the government to not do that and control the interest groups, but the government is the very entity that can take the wishes of interest groups and even the desire of interest groups to harm the rights and liberties of others, and can make legislation out of it that has the veneer of authority that makes it legal, even though it may be unjust and unethical. And so it is the government that grants these privileges. It is the government that uses force in this way. It is the government that legitimizes and brokers and facilitates this whole system of interest groups, even encouraging competition between citizens and different groups to use it as a tool of power against one another. While they do so and create conflict between themselves, they don't recognize that the entity that is facilitating this government continues to grow. So Madison is a genius, but I think he missed something very key here with regard to how this system would work.